Welcome, friends. Let's begin with our customary moment of silence. Thank you, and welcome once again to this convocation. It's now my honor and my privilege, and really a daunting challenge, to introduce Landrum Bolling. Landrum served as Earlham's president from 1958 to 1973. As Earlham historian Tom Ham points out, Landrum was almost certainly not what Earlhamites expected. Born in Parksville, Tennessee, Landrum was the first Earlham president who was not a native Midwesterner. Joining the Society of Friends later in life, he was the first Earlham president who was not a birthright Quaker. And though Landrum had taught political science at Beloit College and Brown University after receiving degrees from the University of Tennessee and the University of Chicago, he was the first Earlham president without an earned doctoral degree, a situation appropriately remedied when over 30 colleges and universities subsequently awarded him over 30 honorary doctorates. Landrum didn't come to Earlham in the first place in a predictable fashion either. A chance encounter with a stranger on a ship in the Atlantic Ocean led to his first job at the college. That stranger turned out to be Elton Trueblood. I just learned from Landrum that, of course, he had read about and things by Elton Trueblood, but had never met him before. Landrum also didn't prepare for his presidency in the now customary fashion by putting in years in various academic administrative roles, but by serving as a correspondent during World War II for the Overseas News Agency, and then by teaching here at the college. During Landrum's tenure as Earlham's president, the college became a truly national institution, created a Phi Beta Kappa chapter, employed its first African-American faculty member, developed many off-campus and international programs, especially expanding the Japanese Studies program, received impressive gifts from the Lilly Endowment and from other foundations, and welcomed the construction of Lilly Library, Horner Residence Hall, Runyon Center, and Dennis and Stanley Halls. All that, again, from Tom Ham. Many other noteworthy events transpired, but you will need to consult the histories, or for the juiciest moments, chat with Landrum himself. Landrum's hugely successful 15-year presidency was, as it turned out, merely the warm-up for his remarkable post-Earlham, internationally recognized service. In subsequent years, he played many roles as peacemaker in conflicts across the globe. He notably served as an informal peace ambassador, shuttling officially and secretly between President Jimmy Carter and Yasser Arafat. He directed the Tantor Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem, an organization dedicated to the search for world peace and justice through theological study, the exploration of human rights, and conflict resolution. And he served for many years, as he continues to do, as senior advisor to Mercy Corps, an international humanitarian agency. The CEO of Mercy Corps once rightly said of Landrum, and I quote, "He has taught the world new solutions for old problems that go beyond the confines of traditional hierarchies, official positions, and cumbersome bureaucracies." In 2000, Landrum received, along with Senator George Mitchell, the Peacemaker Peace Building Award from the National Peace Foundation, and in 2005, he received the James L. Fisher Award for Distinguished Service to Education by the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, an award given on other occasions not only to individuals but to institutions such as the United Negro College Fund, the Lilly Endowment, the Ford Foundation, and the New York Times. Such is just a very, very small sampling of the notable roles Landrum has played and the impressive honors he has received. And any barely serviceable introduction to Landrum must present at least some of these achievements, though I have named only a few. But what we may really want to know about Landrum is something more, some clue that might shed light on the personal capacities that enable him to speak to us today so wisely and with so much experience on the topic of peacemaking. Perhaps one clue comes in the testimony from an Earlham faculty colleague from years past. Landrum, he wrote, is, quote, "a gifted improviser, an inspired crisis manager." I do not know whether he is talking about Landrum's way of coping with student controversies or faculty meetings, but happily enough, these skills turned out to be transferable. Another clue may come from Tom Ham's observation about Landrum's international experience. Writes Tom, Landrum was the most widely traveled president Earlham had ever had, with years of living abroad, including time in Japan, Africa, and the Middle East, as well as most of Europe. He was convinced that greater understanding of diverse cultures and international affairs should be critical elements of a liberal education. My own conversations with Landrum convinced me that one of the best clues might come from an observation made by one of Landrum's former faculty colleagues, the well-known English professor Wayne Booth. In Professor Booth's words, Landrum Bolling has a remarkable capacity for, and I quote, thinking about how the other person feels. And now for a bold vision for peace in the Middle East, please welcome Earlham President Emeritus and ever bold, often unpredictable Landrum Bolling.
Well, dear friends, fellow Earlhamites, I can't tell you what a great pleasure it is for me to be on this platform again and to be looking out at a crowd of Earlham students and faculty and friends, and I hope some neighbors from around the community. It's a very special privilege for me. After an introduction like that, the only thing I can say is that clearly all that shows is that this is an elderly man, a real schizophrenic who can't decide what he's going to do when he grows up. Well, the other thing which is characteristic of mine, I guess, because almost every time I meet somebody I haven't seen in a long time, the first question they'll ask, well, Landrum, where have you been lately? Because they expect I've just gotten off a plane from somewhere. And I have traveled a great deal over the years in the pursuit of various chores and assignments that I've had, many of them far Earlham. But the problem, the issue that drew me to the topic of this convocation and drew me to the Middle East is another story. And I want to say just a little bit about the background of how I happened to get involved in the Middle East. And it all is because of a phone call I received one morning when I was sitting in my office here in the corner of Carpenter Hall. It was a phone call from Colin Bell, who was then the Executive Secretary of the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia. And he said, Landrum, I hear you're about to make a trip to East Africa. And I was. I was going to Kenya in connection with a project which I'd helped to initiate. Earlham took responsibility for helping to develop a new type of comprehensive high school in Kenya, which in fact became a model for a great number of high schools built afterwards. Well, I was still somewhat tied into that project, and so I was making a trip there. Well, Colin Bell said, well, we've heard you're making that trip to East Africa. Would you mind stopping off in the Middle East, in Arab territory in Israel, and see if you can find out from Israeli and Palestinians if there's anything useful that Quakers could do about this conflict? This was March 1968. It's less than a year after the end of the Six-Day War of June 1967. And he said, you know, that war ended, but in fact, the war is still going on. There's still conflict, and it troubles any of us who are interested in peace. Would you stop and see if there's anything useful that Quakers could do? Well, I, of course, agreed to do that, though I privately, secretly felt, oh my goodness, this is kind of a foolish thing to undertake. I'll be greeted to say, oh, well, there's another one of these meddlesome Quakers coming in wanting to get involved in international problems at a high level, and I'll simply be politely ridiculed. But on the contrary, when I stopped off in Cairo and talked to the head of the American embassy, that was just the Egyptians had broken off diplomatic relations with us because they accused the American Air Force of having been the flyers of the planes, the Israeli planes that had destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, which brought an end quickly to the war. Arabs are always very much embarrassed by using the term the Six-Day War. That's a humiliation. But the Israelis could just as well have called it the 6-Hour War, because the Israeli Air Force, with wonderful intelligence, had found out that the Egyptian Air Force went to breakfast at 7:30 promptly every morning. So they organized for the whole Israeli Air Force to attack simultaneously all the Egyptian airfields at 7:30 that morning, and they wiped out the Egyptian Air Force. And with no air cover to protect their thousands of Soviet tanks, the Egyptian war against Israel was over. Well, in any case, I was invited to talk to the people on both sides and see if I could get any suggestion for what Quakers might do. And to my amazement, people said, yes, we'd like to talk about that. So I started out with an interview, I remember, with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Egypt. And I told him of this mission. And to my amazement, he said, oh, I'm so glad. We are trying to get word back to the Israelis that we're ready to make peace. We're enough of war. We don't need any more wars. But the Israelis don't want to listen to this. When you go there, tell them that we really, at the highest level, we want to have peace. We want to negotiate peace. Well, then later on, I went a few days later to Israel. And I had asked, of course, for advice and introductions ahead of time, and one of my best friends was a wealthy Jewish businessman in New York who had very close ties with the leadership in Israel, including Ben-Gurion, who was then the first prime minister, and with Shimon Peres, who later became prime minister. But he said to me, my friend Julius Stallman, he said, Landrum, the man I most want you to meet is a scientist. He's Israel's leading science researcher. He's the head of the Weizmann Institute in Rehoboth. He's very close to the top political leadership. He knows everybody worth knowing, and he's a very bright man. I want you to meet him. So I said, okay. Well, I called up, made an appointment to see Amos de Shalit, the head of the Weizmann Institute. At 10 o'clock on a given morning, I got there, and I found out that was the worst possible day to be there. He was about to have the dedication ceremony of a new building, which a wealthy Jewish British businessman was giving to this institute, giving a whole new building. And so I started backing out the door. I said, oh, Dr. Shalit, I'm sorry to be coming today. Let me come back another day. No, I'll give you an hour right now. And then I'll have somebody show you the campus, and there's to be a ceremony at noon, and I'd like to have you come there if you care. And after that formal ceremony of handing over the keys and all that stuff, there'll be a luncheon, but I don't have to go to that. I'm going to take you off to the side and have a private luncheon with you and a few of my friends that I want you to meet. And I said, Dr. Shalit, forgive me. I know who you are. I know who I am. I'm a college president. I know what my main job is. I've got to raise money. You've got to raise money. Here you've got your donor coming here. You can't turn your back on this. I'm going away to come another day. No. There is nothing more important for an Israeli who's interested in the future of his country than peace. And I want you to meet these people. I'll make my excuses. And so enough, this leading scientist turns his back on the president of Israel, on the ambassador from Britain, on the Nobel Peace Laureate, Literature Laureate that Israel had, that whole distinguished ceremony, and the wealthy donor, and he goes off with Landrum Bolling from Wayne County, Indiana, a meddlesome Quaker, to talk about peace. But I will never forget that conversation. And he said to me right off as we got off in the private dining room with me and the 6 people, he said, I want you to know what the situation is. We Israelis have absolutely no trust whatsoever with the Palestinians. They are our enemies. We don't trust them on anything. They don't trust us. We have no contact. We don't trust the United Nations. I don't think they do either. And he said, and the trouble is there is no contact between us. I don't know any Palestinians. No Palestinians know me. We have no relationship whatsoever. We're total strangers to each other, though we're within the same land. And he said, and I kept apologizing. I said, you know, my presence here is a case of unbelievable non-Jewish chutzpah. And he said, well, let me tell you something. I got more chutzpah than you have. I'm going to tell you, Quakers, what you ought to be doing. I said, okay. He said, I think you should start organizing dialogue meetings between Israelis and Palestinians. And don't get into politics right away. Set up discussion groups of water engineers meeting with water engineers, physical rehab people dealing with physical rehab people, poets meeting with poets, getting people who have common intellectual, social, cultural interests, get them talking together. They'll get on to politics sooner or later. We've got to start building peace from the ground up by people talking to each other. That was one of the most important lessons I learned about this conflict. You have got to get people talking to each other. Well, we started in on that, but I went back to Philadelphia and told the Service Committee what had been proposed by this Israeli leader, and they agreed to detach a couple of people who had had long experience in the Middle East and set them up to organize these discussion groups. And of course, they asked me to go back and be part of it. So we set up a meeting to be held on the island of Cyprus. We had promises from the PLO, they would send a representative from Beirut. We had promises from the Israelis, they would send people. And we arranged for, there would be 4 Israelis and 4 Palestinians to meet in Cyprus and to talk about the problems of peace. The day came, I was there, we made reservations at the hotel in the little town of Kyrenia on Cyprus. Noon came, nobody was there. I don't know, about 1 o'clock, there turned up a Palestinian lawyer and his wife and 2 teenage children. They were the total delegation from the Palestinian side. Nobody came from the PLO, nobody came from Beirut, and nobody came from Israel, no Israelis. That was the beginning of our attempt at dialogue. Well, for my colleagues from the Service Committee, staff, and myself, it was a very interesting day. We spent getting briefed by this Palestinian lawyer who was a genuine peace-loving man. He was a wonderful man. I got to know him well over the years, and he eventually was assassinated. We don't know for what, by some Palestinian extremist, I imagine, or it could have been Israeli. Nobody knows for sure. But that was the beginning of Quaker attempt at dialogue. But after a while, the dialogue meetings got going, and that continued. And I began to find myself drawn more and more into this project. And one of the things that I did was to write up a memorandum for the Service Committee of what I had learned in these early contacts. And they rather liked what I'd put into the memorandum, but they said, oh, Landrum, but there's so many holes in it. There's so many things that ought to be added. You go back and do this again. Well, I have to give the Earlham faculty and board a lot of credit for their patience with me, because during that year, I think I made 5 trips to the Middle East to talk to both Israelis and Palestinians, to get their views, what is the basis of peace. And what surprised me, what absolutely, enlightened me and delighted me, was that I found on both sides very strong interest in moving toward peace and ideas about how it could be done. And so this memorandum that I first wrote, I did various drafts of it. I think I did 17 drafts of it, and finally it grew into the size of a manuscript for a little book. And it was published in 1969 and then another edition in 1970 under the title of Search for Peace in the Middle East. It's probably in the library here, though I think the last time I asked about it, they said, no, we keep a copy there, but it keeps getting stolen, so it never disappears. I don't know whether it's still there or not. I'll see you get a copy if it's not there. Anyway, the Search for Peace in the Middle East was printed privately by the Service Committee. They didn't get a publisher, just hired a printer to turn out my little manuscript into a little book. Well, then came a kind of miracle. On a Sunday afternoon, I remember, I turned on the television, and there was a discussion program from Boston. The master of ceremonies was Roger Fisher of Harvard Law School, who had a weekly program called The Advocates. It's kind of a debate program. And he had arranged a debate between a representative of the Palestinians and a representative of the Israelis. And at the end of that debate on television, he held up a copy of my little book to the camera and said, Here's a little book that the Quakers have just published, and some experts say that it's the most fair and balanced account of what the conflict's about that's in print. And we have some copies we'll send out to those who write in. They might have 5,000 requests. They got 60,000 requests for that pamphlet. And all of a sudden, I was launched on my 15 minutes of fame. NBC wanted me on the Today Show. CBS wanted to interview me. There's ABC, and so it went on. I got invitations to speak in universities all over the country. I spoke at Harvard. I spoke I don't know where all. I was invited to speak at the University of Kuwait and at American University in Beirut. But in some ways, those debates were, those presentations were not all that great for me. When I got to the American University in Beirut, I found they'd set it up as a debate format. And I was to present this Quaker proposal, which was based on the recommendations for peace, as I had got them from moderate, peace-minded people on both sides. And, but it was a very controversial book, it turned out. And the Arabs did not like it. And they had arranged this debate, and so they had the most popular Palestinian professor at AUB was lined up to debate me about this. He was a hardliner. There's no possibility of making peace with the Israelis. We've got to find a way to keep the war going. And he was cheered to the rafters, and when I spoke, I was booed. That was my reception at the American University of Beirut. Then I spoke at the University of Kuwait, and most of the students in the audience were Palestinian young people, the children of Palestinians who were working to help build this little city-state of, very wealthy city-state of Kuwait. And I was again presenting the story of what lay behind this little book and the recommendations for peace negotiations between the two sides. And then I remember in the middle of the speech, I was very indiscreet. I said, I've come to know some of your Palestinian leaders, some of the leaders of the PLO, and I find among them that you still talk about what you call a military option, that the option that you prefer is not negotiation and peace, it's for war and victory, and that you want to pursue a military option. Well, I just want to tell you, quite honestly, quite frankly, unapologetically, I'm going to say it, you have no military option. Talk about a military option is romantic nonsense. Well, the place exploded. And people rushed to the platform. They grabbed the microphone away and started shouting at me. I thought I was going to be beaten up on the spot. But the chairman finally got things under control, and I got away unscathed. But this was typical of the response that came in some quarters to that little book. On the Israeli side, it was a much more mixed kind of reaction. I went back and forth, as I said, a number of times. I showed drafts of my book before it was printed to Israeli leaders. Asked them, did I represent your views correctly? And so I got Israelis to read the manuscript in different forms as I prepared it for publication. And so it was printed. It was translated into Hebrew, into Arabic, into French, into German, and it got a kind of a hearing that would not have been expected. The British Foreign Office, someone at lunch in New York said, this is one of the fairest reports, and it was made a required reading of British diplomats assigned to the Middle East. Weird situation that things developed this way. But in Israel, it was published in English. The Fawcett Publishing House took the rights to bring out a regular paperback. I saw it in Israeli bookstores, and it got quite a discussion there. And I had very interesting talks with the leaders of the Israeli government about it after it came out. And then somehow people within the Israeli government got upset by this book and its potential influence. The book was not allowed to be circulated in Hebrew. The Israeli editor who had handled the translation and got it published tried to get it delivered, get it distributed by Israeli book distributors, and he found to his surprise one after another gave him excuses. Oh no, we can't distribute that, that's not suitable, and so on and so on. So at high places, the Israeli government undertook to suppress this book. But it continued to be circulated and in various ways, and various people within the Israeli establishment were very much in favor of what we were trying to do. But one thing that I learned, being attacked from both sides, was that if people are not ready to make peace, they can always find excuses to continue the conflict. And if they still believe that this conflict can be settled by war, there will always be people, there will always be hawks around who will say, this is not a time for negotiation, this is not a time to make peace, it's a time to carry on the battle to win an ultimate victory. And one of the lessons I think I've learned over the years is, this is one of those many conflicts which will never be settled by war. But on the other hand, finding a way to settle it by peace, by negotiations, is very difficult and very tedious, and for many people, very unpopular thing to do. Now, over the years, I got drawn more and more into discussion of these questions with leaders of the American government. Jimmy Carter and I got acquainted actually before he got the nomination for president. And after he was elected president, he asked me to be a kind of unofficial messenger boy, carrying messages back and forth between him and Arafat. And I had many trips back and forth to Beirut. I met Arafat in Beirut on several occasions. I met him once in Cairo. I met him various times in Tunis. Actually, I was, even after Carter left office in the Reagan administration asked me to go to see Arafat in connection with something that the Secretary of State was concerned about. So here I am again, this strange academic Quaker from Wayne County, Indiana, drawn into these circles in this way. I can't explain it. It's one of those very fluky things. And when people introduced me as an expert on the Middle East, I said, well, we're going to wait a minute. I have no credential whatsoever as an expert in the Middle East. I don't speak or read Hebrew or Arabic. I never took a course in Middle Eastern history. All that I know is what I've learned from people I've got acquainted with on both sides. Well, that's quite itself is an unusual thing. But out of these contexts, out of these relationships, I think I've come to learn a good deal about what the problems are, what are the lessons to be drawn from this experience, and where do we go from here. One of the lessons that I learned very early on, I've mentioned already, was this necessity of people talking to each other. One of the men who influenced me most of all was one of the really founding fathers of the Zionist movement, Dr. Nahum Goldman. He was a brilliant German Jew whose main career was the creating of the Encyclopedica Judaica. He spent, 20 years or more as a scholar in Berlin before Hitler took over, putting together this tremendous cultural academic resource, the Encyclopedica Judaica, about the Jewish faith, the Jewish history. He was the president of the World Zionist Organization. He was president of the World Jewish Congress. After Hitler fled the country, he got out and came to America. He became a leader of the American Jewish community in New York, and he was the founding chairman of the Council of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. Remember that name. If anybody ever asks you about the Jewish establishment in America, the real establishment of the American Jewish community is the Council of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. Nahum Goldman was the founder of that group, was the first chairman of it, but he was a dove. When the State of Israel was created, he said to his colleagues, Golda Meir and Ben-Gurion and others, we have got to sit down and talk to the Palestinians. We're taking their land away from them. They don't like it. They're angry. If we right away proclaim a state and go ahead with it, we're going to find ourselves in war. We need to sit down and see if we can find some modus vivendi with the Palestinians. Oh, no, 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 said Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and others. We can't. The only language those Palestinians understand is force. Our only hope to survive will be to build the best army we can and do that as fast as we can. And this they set out to do, and they did. They created a tremendous military operation. And right away in the very early days, they set out to get the atom bomb, and they got it. The French helped them. And they've had the atom bomb for more than 20 years. Now, you have this strange situation with, on the one hand, people saying we've got to have peace. We need some people saying we have a negotiation. Others saying no, you can't negotiate with these people. We can't talk. Well, Nahum Goldman kept up this argument with the leaders. He was supposed to be in the first cabinet with Ben-Gurion. He wouldn't go. He said, I'm not going till we sit down and talk to the Palestinians. After that, he made his home base in Paris. I used to see him from time to time in Paris, and I'd see him in New York and Washington. He would come here frequently. He was still a devoted Israeli, Jew, activist, supporter of the Zionist movement. But his passion was, let's get down to talking directly with the Palestinians. And he would never go and live in Israel. He kept an apartment there. He'd go there several times a year. But here was this man who said, we can never hope to have any kind of peace until we sit down and talk with the Palestinians. Now, on the Arab side, one of the men who influenced my thinking almost as much as Goldman was a Palestinian medical doctor named Issam Sertawi. Sertawi had been a refugee driven out of the north of Galilee down into Gaza. His father was a school principal, and he saw very quickly that Gaza was going to be one hellhole of a place to live. So he picked up the family and moved to Baghdad. So Issam grew up in Baghdad in Iraq and went to the University of Iraq, graduated in medicine, and came to America to become a heart surgeon. He was trained at the Cleveland Clinic as a heart surgeon. He goes back to the Arab world after he finished his heart surgery training, became a regular doctor for the PLO, but that wasn't good enough for him. He wanted to be an activist. He wanted to be a fighter. So he quit being a doctor and organized a guerrilla group to slip across the border at night into Israel, get into Israeli homes and kill people in their beds. He told me after, I have blood on my hands. This is what I did. But after a few weeks of this, he was revolted by it. And he went to Arafat and said, look, we're going to get nowhere with this. This is wrong. We're killing people, and for what? What are we accomplishing by killing people? We have got to sit down and talk to the Israelis. And Arafat said, I don't believe in that. And he said, well, I know you don't, but I do, and I'm not going to have anything more to do with I'm not going to take part in any of these guerrilla activities anymore. We have got to sit down and talk to the Israelis. Well, finally, Arafat said, well, I don't believe in this, but I'll give you money to open an office in Paris. So he opened an office in Paris to make contact with European Jews and others to try to start talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This was Issam Sertawi, a Palestinian doctor terrorist with blood on his hands. And he succeeded in maintaining the friendship of a number of political leaders. Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, became a friend of his. Bruno Kreisky, the Jewish Chancellor of Austria, became a very close friend of Sertawi's. Pierre Mendès France, the Jewish former Premier of France, became one of his friends. And Sertawi and Mendès France actually drew up a statement of how peace could be started, how peace negotiations get started. And they drew up this joint statement, and they both signed it. A prominent French Jew and this Palestinian PLO representative, they wrote this document, and they published it. And on the day it was published in Paris, it dominated the front page of Le Monde. It was a big story. To think that a Jew and a Palestinian would get together and come up with a statement like this, to the Europeans, this is big news. Not 1 inch of publicity about that appeared in the New York Times or the Washington Post. They didn't think it was a story. It was a big story in Europe, but unfortunately, nothing came of it. Nothing came of it. But Sertawi continued his efforts, and at great risk. Arafat once said to me, you know, my representatives tell me that Sertawi is very careless about his security. We know that he's on the hit list of the Abu Nidal terrorist gang that actually had tried to kill Arafat. He said the Nabal gang have him on a list. They've got a list of 10. They've killed four of them already. Sertawi's on that list, and he's got to be more careful about his security. You tell him. So I saw Sertawi in Paris, and I told him, he said, oh, he said, well, if it happens, it happens. And then I challenged him about smoking. I said, you know, Isam, you're a chain smoker. You're smoking all the time. Don't you know that's bad for your health? You're a medical doctor. He said, yeah, of course, I know it's bad for health. Sure. But I enjoy smoking, and they're going to kill me anyway, so why should I worry? I want to enjoy smoking as long as I can. A few months later, an assassin tracked him down in a hotel in Portugal, put a bullet through his head, and killed my friend Isam Sertawi. Well, I could go on talking at length about the people who have influenced my thinking about these problems. I suppose the one who may have had, next to Nahum Goldmann, as much influence as others, was Bruno Kreisky, the Chancellor of Austria. I don't remember exactly when or where we first met, but I became very good friends with Kreisky. I got a call from him one day asking me to come join him on the island of Mallorca, out off the coast of Spain. He had a rich brother, a rich Jewish brother from Vienna who had become a British subject and become a very prosperous businessman, and he had a villa on the island of Mallorca. And his less affluent but very powerful political brother, the Chancellor of Austria, the head man of the country, had the use of this villa. So I said, fine. I came and I flew over to Madrid and on down to Mallorca and joined Bruno Kreisky. Well, the purpose was he had brought together 2 men and me and wanted the 4 of us to meet for a day and talk about peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And of the 2 people from outside, one was Sertawi, this PLO doctor, and the other was General Matti Peled. Now, Matti Peled was an amazing man. He was one of the heroes of the Six-Day War, not as a field commander, but as the logistics genius who planned that war. And it was his technical planning was very important in the success of the war. But after the war was over, Matti Peled quit the military cold, came to America, brought his family, settled down in Los Angeles to get a PhD degree in Arabic language and literature from the UCLA, went back to Israel. This general, mind you, went back to general to become an academic specialist on Arab culture. And he also decided to go into politics. And as a hero of the war, he had no problem getting elected to the Knesset as an independent. He was elected, I think, 3 times to the Knesset as a dove, outspoken. He told me this story, he went to see Yitzhak Rabin once when Rabin was the defense minister. And he told Rabin, I just want you to know that I'm about to leave for Rome where I'm going to meet leaders of the PLO. And Rabin said, that's against the law, we'll throw you in jail. He said, yes, I know, but you're going anyway. Yes, I am going away, that's why I came to tell you I'm going. Okay, keep me informed. So General Peled went to Rome, made contact with the PLO, and continued that dialogue. Well, in the island of Mallorca, General Peled, Isam Sertawi, Bruno Kreisky, and I spent a fascinating day together. I remember walking along the beach, a break in our conversation, and I said to Kreisky, I said, you know, these two guys have hit it off amazingly well. They talk back and forth about the issues, and it's incredible how much they agree on of what would make a peace between the two sides. He said, yes, there's no question. These two men could make a peace. They know what the issues are that could be solved. Well, some years later, I had a kind of a replay of that at a different level. One of my friends in Israel over the years was Ezer Weizmann, who was the founder, first head of the Israeli Air Force, and later was defense minister. Then finally he was president of Israel. Ezer Weizmann is a very intelligent, very articulate, and very independent man. I called him up one day and said I'd like to see him, and he said, well, come see me on Sunday morning. I said, okay, where? He said, well, meet me in the Prime Minister's office at 12 noon. I said, okay, and hung up. And then I thought, 12 noon, the Prime Minister's office, they have a cabinet meeting every Sunday morning from 9 o'clock till noon and later. I mean, this is crazy. Why is he having me do this? Well, anyway, I went there. Well, sure enough, at 12 noon, I'm sitting in the anteroom of the Prime Minister's office in Israel. In walks Ezer Weizmann, and he pulls, fingers over his arm. Boy, am I glad to get out of that meeting. He said, this was after Sadat had made his famous trip to speak at the Knesset. He said, Sadat made a gesture to friendship and to start peace talks. He held out his hands to us, and Begin has given him his little finger. Begin is letting the best opportunity for peace we've ever had go down the drain. And I'm stunned. What's going on? Landrum Bolling from Wayne County, Indiana, sitting in the Prime Minister's office, this Minister of Defense is telling me that his Prime Minister is blowing it with regard to peace between the two sides. Well, that was Ezer Weizmann. He was a very independent man. Later on, I saw him once, and we were talking about that. He said, you know, Sadat and I hit it off very well when we first met, and we've kept in touch. And he said, you know, if we had freedom to really take this thing in hand, President Sadat and I could settle this thing in 30 days. Well, that was very interesting. It just happened that a few days later I was in Cairo, and I was invited to come down and visit President Sadat at his seaside villa outside of Alexandria. So I go to see Sadat, and we have a nice talk together. And I said, you know, I just had a visit with a friend who's a really friend of yours, Ezer Weizmann, the other day, and he said that if you two men had the freedom to make the full decision, you could settle this conflict between Arabs and Israelis in 30 days. And Sadat sort of pulled himself up and said, 30 days? No, 30 hours. We could settle it in 30 hours. The problems are not insoluble. Well, where does this lead us? Well, where it led me, where it led most people, was to support the idea of a two-state solution. Little by little by little, the idea that peace could be made took root. Little by little, it came to be seen by the Israelis that you could talk to the PLO, you could talk to Arafat, it would be possible to start negotiations. Well, what would they negotiate about? Well, it would be for two states, and it would be going back to the resolution that it passed in 1947 that called for the division of the Holy Land into an Arab state and a Palestinian state. There was nothing new about the two-state solution. There it was already spelled out in 1947 in the UN, adopted by the UN, accepted by the Americans and others. Well, what went wrong? Why didn't this two states come into being? They were supposed to be created simultaneously after that resolution. Well, what happened was that the truth was that neither the Israeli leaders nor the Palestinian leaders accepted that partition plan. Neither side wanted to partition the Holy Land. Why? Because each side wanted all of it. That's the simple fact. The Palestinians want all of it. They didn't want to divide it with the Israelis. The Israelis wanted all of it. They didn't want to divide part with the Palestinians. And so they were opposed to it. The Israeli leadership and the Israeli public, the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian subjects were almost united. The one person who said we have to accept it was David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion, if you go back and read his history, and he's one of the most fascinating figures in this whole story. Ben-Gurion took the position, no, we have to accept partition. And his leadership was opposed to him. They fought him hard as could be. No, 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 we cannot do that. We don't want partition. We want the whole of it. And he said, we have got to accept partition. If we accept partition, that's a plus for us politically. The Palestinians, of course, are going to turn it down. We cannot afford to turn it down. We have to accept it. It doesn't mean that we have to follow what that means, but we have to say we accept it. And he did. And he said, the one thing that we have to do is to see that a state is created as fast as possible. He was, in a sense, one of the most skillful political tacticians of the 20th century. He saw ahead what was possible. If we accept the partition resolution, then we can move ahead to establish a state and do it quickly. And once we have a state, then we can get more and more. And he was not afraid of war. He believed that the Israelis had enough military strength, enough military equipment, enough military background that they could take on the Arab world and defeat them. And he was right, though all the world couldn't believe that. And the myth that grew up around this period was that little Israel was surrounded by all these hostile Arab countries, millions of people, huge armies, and Israel was a defenseless little David against this Goliath. The opposite was true. The Arabs were disorganized. They were poorly trained. They had bad equipment or no equipment. And Jordan had a secret deal with the Israelis whereby the Jordanians would accept the existence of an Israeli state, and the Israelis would allow Jordan to annex the West Bank. That was a secret deal made between Golda Meir and King Abdullah I of Jordan. It didn't work out in the end, but that was a deal that the Israelis and the Jordanians made in the midst of the period that they were supposed to be fighting each other. Well, the two-state solution idea did finally gain acceptance. There was efforts by Carter and others to push things along this way. And so eventually the two-state solution became the formula that was to be adopted. And I wrote about it. My little book talks about it for one of the earlier discussions of the two-state idea. Two states living side by side in peace and security. This is the formula. A Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, the main capital of Israel in West Jerusalem, and with the Palestinians holding 22% of the land. In the original resolution of 1947, the UN specified that Israel would get about 55% of the land, the Palestinians 48% of the land. Well, when the war broke out, and Israel very quickly won, and they won that war in about a week. It dragged on, and the negotiations spent some months. But basically, the war was over in about a week, and Israel won a very convincing victory. And out of that victory, they wound up with 78% of the land, which they claimed from that time on, and the Palestinians only 22%. So now when in more recent years the two-state solution came to the fore, the Israeli state was to be made up of 78% of the Holy Land. The Palestinian state, the Arab state, that had the majority population in the beginning, had 22% of the land. And supposedly this was to be done. And the Palestinians, after lots of debate and argument about it, basically their leadership agreed that they would accept 22% of the land to have an independent state of their own. And that's essentially what they've been negotiating all these past several years. But they don't ever get it settled. In principle, as they sometimes say, there's a package deal that's been on the table for years, a two-state solution. The Palestinians 22% of the land, the Israelis 78% of the land. That's the deal. Why does it never get settled? Why is it never signed? Why is it never implemented? Well, it's never going to be implemented. And part of the message I want to bring to you is the two-state solution is dead. There's no way it's going to come about. For example, why? There are now 600,000 Israeli Jews who live on confiscated Arab land in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. About 200,000 live in modern new apartment blocks on the edge of Jerusalem, land that was previously just over the border inside the Arab territory. They now are occupied by Israeli Jews. They've built these wonderful apartments, and it's part of greater Jerusalem now. And the Palestinians know that's finished, that's settled, that's never going to change. That 200,000 Jews are going to stay in those apartments. But then in the West Bank, there are now 150 Israeli settlements from one end of the country to the other. Those settlements are linked together by roads that are exclusively for the use of Jews. On any given day, there's something like 500 Israeli military checkpoints checking the movement of Arabs from one village to another. You're going to make an Arab state out of that? You expect the Arabs to accept a state in which there are 400,000 to 500,000 people in 150 settlements scattered throughout the land? That there are military checkpoints in the country? That there are military installations on the high ridges and along the Jordan Valley? And they would cut off any Palestinian state from any contact with any country outside. The state of Palestine would be totally encircled by Israeli territory. That would be a state, an independent, sovereign state? No way. No way. Even the most venal Palestinian politician would never sign into that deal. Now, we have been trying, we Americans, to broker this deal for a long time. When Obama was elected, he appoints General George Mitchell as his special envoy on the Middle East, which is a wonderful choice. Mitchell has a great record. He was a main figure in bringing about peace in Northern Ireland. He's highly respected by everybody, Democrats and Republicans. He's a very, very knowledgeable, intelligent man. He had two missions given by Obama. One was to persuade Netanyahu to stop building settlements, that the settlement construction, which has been going on year after year after year, the Israelis had to stop that, had to curtail that, and with the curtailment of the Israeli settlements, then it would be possible to create a Palestinian and Israeli states. Well, that is not going to happen. The Israeli government is not going to stop building settlements. They've made promises, or have seemed to be making promises a number of times in the past, to stop settlements. But the settlement construction goes on year after year, day after day. And they're now building Jewish settlements inside East Jerusalem. Last time I was in Jerusalem, I went a couple of blocks from the hotel where I normally stay in East Jerusalem. And in that block, Israelis had moved Jews out of their homes. I moved Palestinians out of their homes. And Israelis were either there or were preparing to move in. And the Palestinians were sleeping in cots on the sidewalk. And every Friday afternoon, there is a political protest of this acquisition of Palestinian homes for the benefit of Israeli settlers. And Israeli Jews, mind you, are very active participants in those protests. go to Jerusalem on Friday afternoon. You can attend a protest against this policy. And I'd say at least half of the protesters are Israeli Jews. Israel is undergoing a kind of existential crisis. Who are we? Where are we going? What's going to happen to us? One of the tragic examples of this crisis is in the person of one man named Avraham Burg. Avraham Burg's father was a rabbi who founded one of the religion parties. Avraham himself joined the Labor Party and rose in the ranks. He became the Speaker of the Knesset. Avraham Burg has now renounced his Israeli citizenship. He's written a book saying Zionism is dead. We have killed it. Now, he's not a popular figure in Israel, you can imagine. But this is a legitimate Israeli Jew, a Zionist leader, who at this stage in his life is renouncing what he was brought up to believe in. Where is this going? How many Jews believe this? How many? I don't know. I'm sure the bulk of the Israelis have not accepted that point of view. But there is a crisis going on inside Israel, as well as between Israel and the Palestinians. And the two-state solution, I would say, is finished. So what is the bold vision of a new peace that I'm trying to present? I'm saying we need to go back to the UN Resolution 181. UN Resolution 181 has the subtitle of Plan of Partition with Economic Union. Plan of partition with economic union. 2 states, but with a federal structure. That's the provision that was adopted in 1947 by the UN, and the United States voted for it. It was never implemented. It was never taken seriously. The UN resolution specifies what economic union would mean. It spells out common currency, a customs union, joint economic development, joint land policies with regard to land reclamation and land soil conservation, mutual equal access to power and water, freedom of movement back and forth, rights of visit and transit and life in either side by either Jews or Palestinians. That was the provision of this resolution, that the only international document legitimatizing the state of Israel and the state of Palestine, adopted in 1947. Could we go back to that, take it seriously, try to implement it, find out some formula of federation that could be acceptable by both sides? I don't know. People tell you over and over, oh, that's too idealistic, it's too romantic, it'll never happen. The two-state solution, as it's now set up, is an illusion. It's romantic nonsense. It's not going to happen. What I think the challenge is to find a structure, a formula, a set of beliefs that will enable Palestinians and Israelis to live together under the same roof. And so my suggestion is what we need to be agitating for is a political entity called Israel, with its own flag, its own passport, its own local self-government, its own citizenship requirements, and so on. But having the right to live anywhere in that land, where any of these settlements are. I would not abolish the settlements if you were asking me to come up with a formula. No, leave the Jewish settlements alone. Let them live there, but live there under this condition of a kind of a federal union. Could it happen? I think it's a more realistic possibility than anything else that's on the table. Last time I was in the area about a year ago, I had a visit with a Bethlehem businessman, and I asked him what he thought about the two-state solution or the one-state solution or whatever. And he said, oh, I don't care about the government. He said, I just have 2 requirements as far as I'm concerned as a Palestinian. I have a big family. And like big extended families, we sort of live together. I have 2 homes. One is in Jerusalem, and it happens to be in a Jewish neighborhood. But that's fine. I get along fine with my Jewish neighbors. I have a home there, and I want to keep it. I also have a home here in Bethlehem, and part of my family lives here, and I spend part of my time here. I want security to hold the ownership of the land and houses I have owned for years. That's one thing. And the other thing I want to be able to get in my car and drive from one end of this territory to another to see my relatives, to see my business associates, to see my friends, without going through an Israeli military checkpoint and being turned back and said, no, your papers are not in order, you can't go. I want freedom to move anywhere in this land, and I want security in my house. I don't care what kind of government there is. Where are we going? Is it possible? I think people would say, well, it's not possible because the two people are too hostile to each other. Well, that's not quite right. The degree to which Israelis and Palestinians have found it possible to live in harmony is amazing, just amazing. And I would like to just refer to some of those evidences of the capacity of Israelis and Palestinians to live together. There's a kibbutz, for example, just off the road from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. I've been there now for about, 30 years or so. A joint Israeli-Palestinian kibbutz, a cooperative farm program. I think there are 35 families, about half of them Jewish, about half of them Palestinian, living together, common education for their children in both Hebrew and in Arabic, and working together on the land. That's been going steadily, and it's expanding. I just got a notice the other day. I send them a little contribution every now and again. I got a letter just this past week saying we're going to expand to 60 families this coming year. They're not going out of business. There is a little organization called Seeds of Peace, the executive director of which is an Earlham graduate and a member of the Earlham board, Bobby Gutschalk. I happen to be wearing the Seeds of Peace tie today. The Seeds of Peace is a great project. It was conceived by a Jewish friend of mine, a former journalist who's now passed away. He had the idea that if you could get Jewish young people, 15, 16 years old, and Arab and Israelis to come together for a summer camp, they would begin to know each other and develop friendship. Well, it was kind of a radical idea, but it worked out. And John, my friend, was able to get a use of a Jewish camp after the season was over for a couple of weeks. And now they've taken over the camp completely. And Bobby told me just the other day that this past season they had four weeks, or one group, and then 4 weeks another, and altogether they had about 200 Arabs and Jews, young people together in these camps. That's been going on now for almost 20 years. It's succeeding, it's working, and the people are happy. I've been there a couple of times and interviewed Israeli and Palestinian young people. How do you find it? I remember talking to a young Palestinian woman. She said, until I came here, I'd never known a Jew. I'd always been afraid of Jews. I'd been hostile to Jews. But here in this camp, we got to know each other as human beings. And there's a Jewish girl here, and I've been the best friends. My whole attitude has changed. That's happening. That's a reality. There's now a youth orchestra that tours Europe and America, organized of young Israelis and young Palestinians, gifted musicians. This was organized by two friends, one Palestinian American, Edward Said, a very, people would say, radical Palestinian nationalist, professor at Columbia University for a number of years, and his Jewish partner, Daniel Berenbaum, one of the most distinguished pianist conductors in the world. He's a musical director of I don't know how many different internationally known orchestras and opera houses now. Daniel Berenbaum and Edward Said had this idea. They both were music lovers. They were organizing a joint Israeli-Palestinian youth orchestra and training them to high standards, demanding that they meet high standards, and then hit the road and put on concerts all over the world. They're doing it. It's a success. There is a movement called Peace Now. It's organized by Israeli Jewish military officers during the War of Lebanon in 1982. That was a war which ended with this horrible massacre of Sabra at Shatila, which the Israelis were not really responsible for. This was done by the hardline Christian Phalange, who sent their thugs into this Palestinian camp and slaughtered over 1,000 innocent, mostly women and children. The Israelis, of course, got blamed for that, though actually they didn't do it. It was the Lebanese extremists who did the killing, but the Israelis were standing by and let it happen. And the Israeli military young officers were so indignant at such a shameful thing that had happened. They organized the biggest political protest that had ever been held in the Middle East up to that time. 400,000 Jews marched in the streets of Tel Aviv to protest Sabra and Shatila and to blame the Israeli leadership, particularly Ariel Sharon, for this atrocity. Peace Now is still a going concern. It's one of the most active peace groups in Washington, Americans for Peace Now. They don't give up the struggle. They are struggling, arguing, writing, speaking for peace and reconciliation day and night. It's a wonderful group, Americans for Peace Now. And I could go on down the list of a lot of others. I am convinced that peace could be made in which you would have a federated state. And I just want to close, if I've got time, to just read you a paragraph or two from a book that I just pulled out of my library here this morning. One of my best friends among the Israelis over the years was a man named Lova Eliaf. Lova was a very important figure in the Labor Party. He was the Secretary General of the party for a time. He was next in command to Golda Meir. If he had stayed on good terms with Golda, they fell out, went their different ways. But if he'd stayed on, he no doubt would have been Prime Minister of Israel. Now this is a little story I want to read you. After the 1967 war, Eliaf resigned his post as deputy minister and received the permission of Eshkol, the prime minister, and Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, to spend half a year exploring the new territories with the explicit intention of learning the problems of the Arabs of the territories. At the end of the 6 months, in a meeting with Eshkol, Eliaf responded that he had discovered in the territories an evolving Palestinian nation with all the trappings which make the national movement and a people. This national evolution, he added, constitutes the main problem of our own life and existence in Zionism and as Jews. And we must consider how to solve this problem. He recommended undertaking a massive economic development plan as part of a broad effort to reduce the plight of the Palestinian refugees who now lived under Israeli rule in poverty. Citing the experience, the expertise he had acquired in Arab and Gaza, Eliaf asked to be appointed to head such a proposal. Eshkol sent Eliaf to discuss the idea with Dayan, who was Minister of Defense, and he was opposed. He also took it up with Golda Meir, and she was openly negative. What Palestinian people? Where is there an evolving nation? What are you talking about? As for Eliaf's plan for economic development for the Palestinian refugees, she quoted a biblical passage, "The poor of your own town must have preference. We have enough problems of our own." A discouraged Eliaf agreed for the time being to accept Eshkol's suggestion to drop the policy. However, Eliaf did not give up entirely. In November of 1968, he published a booklet in Hebrew in which he reviewed basic Zionist ideals in light of the struggle with the Arabs. And during the struggle, he wrote, "The nucleus of a Palestinian Arab nation, a twin to the Jewish people in the land of Israel, started to appear. It may well be that such is the nation, such a people, that this has to happen." Anyway, this was the judgment of this longtime dear friend of mine, Lova Eliaf, that there was such a people. Now, this issue comes up again just recently in the presidential Republican campaigns with the statement that there's no such people as Palestinians. They are an invented people, said Gingrich the other day. And somebody else said, no, there's nothing to this Israel. Israel owns all of that land. The Palestinians don't own any of it. It all belongs to Israel. Well, the level of discussion about this problem is not always at the highest level. I'm not sure whether the ideas I put before you today are acceptable to you or to our community, our nation. But I am deeply convinced that we will never have peace in the area until we put our faith, our hope, in the people who want to live together and are willing to live together in peace and mutual security. This is not an insoluble problem. It is a problem that cries out for attention and solution. And my belief is that solution, that bold vision of a peaceful Middle East can be realized if we had the courage to try it. And the formula is already in print. Resolution 181 is on the record books. Go back and study it, review it, revise it. No doubt there have to be changes made. But if we had the courage and the vision to say, it is possible to find a way in which Israelis and Palestinians can live together under the same broad roof, can work together to satisfy their own national aspirations, and find out how they can prosper together. One final note economically. The economic future of that region, without a doubt, lies in more than anything else in the cultivation, development, expansion of tourism. There is no place on earth comparable to this small little strip of land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean to draw tourists and religious pilgrims, Muslims, Christians, Jews. To have a successful tourism industry, you need peace. You need to have a way of coordinating bus schedules, hotel accommodations. The development of tourism ought to be the undergirding economic base of the prosperity of both peoples, and could be. But you have to have peace. You have to have cooperation. You have to have a belief that we can live together. I believe, because I have too many friends on both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, who believe that they can live together, who want peace, and are willing to work for it. And I just plead and pray with you that we give our support to a constructive dialogue about this possibility in America, because in the end, the United States, whether we like it or not, will be a major player in whatever works out. Or we're going to get part of the blame, as we do now, for the failure to make peace. We don't need to have continued war in the Middle East on our conscience as Americans. We ought to have in our heads a vision of a peaceful Middle East that we could help build. you.